So I have a little analogy here that I like to use to think about how this unified field of consciousness works. And here I got a little prop for you. It's a sponge. So what's cool about a sponge, of course, as you know, and as you can see here, is that it's got all these tiny little bubbles in it. They don't actually look like complete bubbles because we've actually sliced through them such that you're actually seeing like half bubbles. But inside, you can use your mind's eye to imagine that. Actually, inside the sponge, deep in there, where we haven't sliced through, there are entire, complete, self-contained bubbles. And so what this sponge represents, it represents all of reality or all of existence. This is everything that ever existed or ever will exist right here. This is that one unified field of consciousness that I'm talking about. This is everything you've ever experienced. And a lot more. Because what you are in this analogy is you are one of these bubbles. So imagine if you could kind of like look through one of those bubbles. What do you see? Well, you only see the back of the bubble there, right? Like this. And like if you're looking through it, you just see the back of the bubble like this. You're looking through this way. And so that's like your whole life. You've lived your whole life as that bubble. And here you're living it right now. This very moment that's happening right now, the room that you're sitting in, wherever you are, that's you inside of this bubble. Now, what you've believed your whole life is you've believed that, yes, there is this bubble, but you've also believed that there's something beyond the bubble, some objective, material, external reality beyond the bubble. And you've also believed that this bubble is happening to some kind of object, like there's like a brain somewhere in the external world back there, or there's some kind of biological creature who is experiencing this bubble. But what you can see from this analogy, and why we're talking about it, is that there's no subject. There's only the bubble. There's only the object. This entire sponge is just free floating out in the vacuum of empty space, you might say. And now you might wonder, well, Leo, but who's experiencing, who's perceiving this sponge? And of course, that's the mind fuck of it, is that the answer is nobody. There's nobody to perceive the sponge. The sponge just is. That's what we mean by being. Being is just a thing that just is without anybody looking at it. That doesn't necessarily change how it looks. It just changes what you understand looking to be. And it eliminates you from the equation. It depersonalizes everything. See? Now, it's still a bit inaccurate even to say that this sponge is just floating out in the vacuum of empty space, because actually, time and space, this sponge does not occur within time and space. I mean, it does here, because we're limited to that right now. But if we're going to take this as the analogy for all of reality, time and space is happening inside the sponge. The sponge is actually itself not constrained or limited to time and space, nor is it constrained or limited by physical or logical laws. Because all of those physical and logical laws, as you know them, that's happening inside of these various bubbles. In fact, you could have different bubbles with different logical laws, different timelines, different spatial dimensions, and so forth. You can have like 4-dimensional bubbles, 5-dimensional bubbles, and anything else you can imagine. This sponge itself is actually infinite. So of course, even though here right now, I'm only presenting it to you as a 3-dimensional object, in the analogy, in the full analogy that I'm trying to get across to you, imagine that this sponge, it doesn't actually have a shape. It extends this way and this way and this way, up and down and in every direction. And of course, not just in 3 dimensions, but an infinite number of dimensions. So if you imagine that, of course, if you did that now, the sponge becomes infinite and it doesn't even have a shape anymore. You can't think of it as being round or square or anything. It literally takes up everything. It's total. It's infinite. That's what infinite means. And you are just one of these tiny little bubbles in this giant thing. And your mom, your dad, your cat, your dog, your boss, your brother, your sister, what are they? They're just other bubbles in this thing. But look at this. Are the bubbles actually a thing? Are they actually real? No, they're just negative space. What's actually real, you might say, is the yellow substance, the foam. That's what's real. The bubbles are really just sort of illusions. There's no substance to the bubble. It's hollow. See? And moreover, all of the bubbles are really, what are they? Are they separate? No, it's the exact opposite. They're all unified. In fact, the space of all of these bubbles is the exact same space. It's one space. It's just emptiness. It's one emptiness. So, as I've said before in my episode about the radical implications of oneness, I said we're all one. Well, this explains why when I say we're all one, I'm not speaking metaphorically or poetically, or I'm not saying some wishy-washy, new agey platitude of like, oh yeah, we're all one, let's love each other. No, what I mean is very literally, physically. We're all one in the same way that all of these bubbles in this sponge are all one. And in fact, this entire sponge is just all one. But in order to realize that, you need to stop identifying with being one of these bubbles. And you need to realize that you are the entire thing. And not only are you the entire thing, but that the entire thing itself is also infinite. And if you grasp that, that is enlightenment. Enlightenment is going from believing that you're one of these bubbles to realizing that you're the entire sponge and that the entire sponge is infinite. And that this right here, this yellow sponge, this is God. This is what God is. This is what God consciousness is when you realize that you're this entire thing. And that is, believe it or not, actually possible to do. Now, of course, you probably won't do it in 5 minutes. You probably won't have this realization while you're sitting here listening to me, although you could. That's sort of the ideal scenario. But, you know, it usually takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of meditation, contemplation, psychedelics, and other things like that to help you to realize this. But this is what enlightenment is. This is what every mystical teaching and school and religion is pointing to, it's pointing to this. But notice, because this thing, you know, it's so total and it's so vast and it's so epic and mind-blowing that it's really difficult to explain it to you, and that no analogy or metaphor really does justice to it. So don't take this foam example too literally, because of course there's limitations. You know, I'm limited to 3D space and time, and we're limited to language, which is necessarily dualistic, but you can grasp this in one go. You can just use your consciousness to directly realize that you're not perceiving the sponge, you are the entire sponge. And that, in fact, there is nobody who will perceive this sponge. There is only the sponge, there is only the external world, so to speak. There is no internal world. But really, that's the same thing as saying that the internal world and the external world, that they merge and collapse into one another, which is what non-duality is, right? It's the collapsing of all categories and distinctions, including the distinction between subject and object, and inner and outer, internal and external, mind and body. So this is how we resolve the mind-body problem, you see? So we're going from the mind-body dualism of Descartes, and we're unifying it all into one field of consciousness.